We're filming it today, like we talked about last Sunday, so people who are not here can see it, and these things are going to be put on YouTube, okay? And then we're going to take them down in a few weeks. They're not going to be up there permanently because I don't want, this is going to be presented in the guided discussion style, okay, like we've been doing. I'm not going off of really a strict schedule on notes or things like this. I have some notes. I put some notes together that I studied for over the weekend. And but really, leadership, there's so much out there on leadership. And people make careers out of talking about leadership. They give seminars, they hold conferences, they write books, and everybody says the same thing in a different way. And it's quite amazing how you can do that and be so successful. But leadership, human leadership is just human leadership. It's always been basically the same. And it always will be. Because really who you are is just the same type of person who was in the past. I read a book on the Peloponnesian War when I was a young NCO, and it took me forever to get through. It was about that thick, by a guy named Donald Kagan. And man, that guy knew everything about the Grecian War between Athens and Sparta. That's what the Peloponnesian War is, okay? And the thing that struck me most, I mean, there was a lot of human drama, there was a lot of cheating and warfare and tactics and armies and navies and styles of ships and how they developed during the war. It was a 30-year war. 30 years. These two Greek states, city-states, fought one another, and Sparta finally won and occupied Athens for a year and said, you know, we don't even like it here, and left and went home. So human dynamic really never really changes. And I was thinking to myself at the time, man, if you took the United States and the Greeks and just did this, we would act the exact same way. Come on in. We would act the exact same way in different times. This was 430 BC. 430 to 400. You go backwards coming to the cross, and then you go forwards going back. So 430 to 400 BC was when this war was taking place. Those people and people today in 2019 do the exact same thing. It's incredible. So leadership is leadership. Now you have led people before on different levels. Okay? And I'm not going to talk about, you know, I'm not going to say, hey, I know everything about leadership, but I've done a lot of leading. Okay? And I have a few things to say. But they're going to apply to all of us. So I guess right now, because we are so pressed for time, I'm just going to ask you, this class, just let me say, this class is on leadership. This is our first class in this little series that we're putting together. It's guided discussion format. And the title of this is, What is a Leader? What is a leader? Last time we looked at, last time we looked at this little church history, impromptu church history class. And what do you remember about this class? Why is it important that we talk about this? Because we're talking about church leadership here in the churches of Christ. We're going to limit our scope to churches of Christ. You can take it and use it outside, but we want to talk about churches of Christ because we are developing ourselves as leaders in the church of Christ. Okay? So let's limit it to that narrow boundary. Why is it important then to go over church history? Knowing that.
See how things were done prior so that we can make sure that we're following God's Word and standing with the truth.
Right. We need to know how things were in the past because we are this organization today. And an organization today needs to know how it developed, what foundation we have. Harlan?
Well, I was just going to say, to get back to the basics and to know what your foundation is.
Okay. Did you raise your hand? Okay.
Along the same lines, just knowing why we are where we are, how we got here, that it was a process that occurred to get where we are now.
Okay. Okay.
Not random.
So, okay, yeah, exactly. So just to recap, here's the cross, and then we talked about the early first century churches, how they formed based on what the leader in that family, who was the man, had heard from Jesus, right? And then we had these little churches form, and they didn't have complete knowledge because the Bible that we know didn't come about till when? 325, right? Ish, okay? 325 was, the way I understand it, was kind of a secondary effect of the Nicene Council after the Arian controversy, and talk about the Trinity. We talk about all this, right? So 325 forward all the way up to 1517, which is when what happened? 95 Theses, and who was that? Martin Luther. Right. Martin Luther and those who protested the Catholic Church and what it was doing were called the what? Protestants. And then we have the development of the church in the after that, and then come to the new country. This is half the United States, and then we have the division that occurred during the Civil War. So we understand where we are with all of this, right? Okay. So this is called high church. What are we called? Low church. And why is that? Because we have no hierarchy, right? Every congregation is autonomous, and it does what with its leadership? It chooses its own. It chooses its own elders and deacons, and then it hires a what? And we talked about how diverse those congregations are, and how that whole located preacher thing was a real problem to begin with. And we have come a long way since then, but we are still low church because of our hierarchical makeup. And so it's important to understand then, if we are going to be leaders in a group that has no hierarchy above us, no one's going to be telling us what to do, when to do it, how to do it, we need to develop our own leaders. We call that growing our own, right? Unfortunately, do we have a method of doing this that's standardized? No. No, we don't. So what happens usually in congregations? You know, you've been in congregations enough. Tell me about it. Someone who cares picks up a lot of the slack, right? What if you're a man and you were asked to be an elder and you choose to take on that role? What happens then? Is there a school you go to? Are there classes? You just are a guy who became an elder and now you're an elder. Is that acceptable in like your work situation or any other situation? Even getting a license to drive a truck? I mean, so it's not an acceptable role, but it's not an acceptable method, but we see it everywhere. Yes, ma'am.
I don't think most congregations expect a lot of growth from their elders because we have already chosen people that hold beliefs that are comfortable to us. And so why would we want them to grow and learn things that are not comfortable to us? I think that's kind of an underlying problem, that maybe there's not a lot of desire for growth.
Maybe there's not a lot of desire for growth. Is that
For the congregation.
is that something that people think about? Is it just people don't generally think?
I think it's nice to be comfortable.
Say that again. Yeah, but we are expected to grow. God expects us to grow. So, and I'm not going to ask the question why, because no one really knows why we don't prod growth. And we can suppose, I can suppose that we just take the most easy path, the path of what? Least resistance. That's what we always do as human beings. That's what we always do. So congregations do the same thing unless they have a what? Leader who is going to prod them to grow. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, as a congregation, I don't think they expect the elders to like attend a school or a formal way of approach of education. But as an eldership, I've come to learn they do sometimes spur each other on to grow deeper and to try to like
And that's a good thing. The prodding that comes from within is a necessary
I mean,
thing.
we're lucky enough to have like 8 elders and we prod each other in eldership, but you know, 2 or 3 is probably less prodding. You know what I mean? So, and more, standard, what I'm trying to say, just status quo or just consent to be the way you are, you know?
Well, I just found out last week that the elders get together and pray for us when they gather in a room, but we need to know about that, you know, for us to know that, I mean, that they're praying for us.
Well, this is a general statement, okay? That every leadership team has its own way of doing things, and that's good,
Which is part of the autonomy.
which is part of autonomy. And I'm not saying these things to criticize. I'm just saying these things to make us aware that we don't think about leadership in the congregations. But we do complain when no one wants to step up and take a role. And those of us who do take roles sometimes get angry that we're always continually having to take roles. Although I'm never going to stop, for example, taking a role. Because in my background, you never ever turn down an opportunity to lead. Because it makes you better and because people need it. Okay? And that's the way I look at leadership in a congregation. Yes, ma'am.
I think the fear with growth sometimes is that there's compromise for that growth. Because I think that that's what we've seen a lot in other churches of Christ is that like they might be growing, but are they sticking closely with what the Bible says? And so then I think sometimes in our smaller churches like ours, we're afraid of compromising things, which I'm totally for that. I fall into that as well. That, you know, in order to get growth, you need to be doing music, or in order to get growth, you need to be controversial in some way, you know. And so I think that sometimes we get afraid of growth because of that stigma attached with it.
Are
What-
you talking about numerical growth or spiritual growth?
I think in both, you know, and talking about things that are maybe tradition that we do just because it's tradition, you know, and even like if even in how we say, because James and I have been talking about this, in how we say that we pick our elders, but really the Holy Spirit picks our elders, and it's evident by their actions that they should be an elder. They're already doing the things that are outlined in Titus, and that's a different thought for me to grapple with. That like we pick them because they're already doing those things, not because we check. You know, they'll fit the bill if we ask them, then we'll check it off. You know, that kind of stuff. But then also numerical growth, because we see so many dying churches. You know, of Christ and of Baptist churches and things that are very small that we get so stuck in. We do it this way. We do it this way. That we don't do it with other people.
You have some people that will choose or recommend certain leaders because they think that they would produce the member growth.
Right.
In all honesty, you might have some churches. I think like Highland has done some of that where they included women in their leadership roles, and they included young men in leadership roles without some of the experience and knowledge base that the Bible does recommend that they have, because of the, I don't know the reasoning behind it because I wasn't a part of that decision at all, but it appears that it would have a lot to do with trying to change the way that the dynamic is done in the congregation in order to encourage more numerical growth as well. And so, yeah, you have churches that are afraid that they're going to fall wayside and that they're not going to continue on, so they try and alter their ways of doing things that sometimes does gear them away from the way that the Bible does it, which
Okay.
is unfortunate.
Okay, so is that good leadership or bad leadership?
I would say bad for sure.
Did the Holy Spirit choose those guys? We need to get back on track. Hang on a second. Matt, Adam has a question, but then we're going to move on because I have to ask a few questions of you to keep the track on. Yes?
I think this fits in here, and it may not. I may be kind of the suggested, where it's mentioned in Acts or something that this is the way to do it. And then there is traditions. And as we get into talking about church leadership, we need to be careful that we don't compromise on the thou shalt not. On that, the middle, the suggested stuff, we need to make sure that we are holding that true, and that we take into account the context that is surrounding. So is that this is what needs to be done, or is that a context that we need to take that into account? And then when it gets down to opinions, we need to step back and realize that they may have a different opinion than I do, but that should not be a reason to split the church or to cause any issue. So
That's right.
if I'm in a church and I don't like that opinion, maybe I need to go find another church and not cause issues with it. I think that's something to keep in mind as we get to talking about leadership, that we don't let that get in the way.
Those are good points. What is leadership? What's the definition of leadership?
Taking a role of authority.
Well, okay, so you become a leader if you take a role of authority, but that's not what leadership is. Yes? Being a person that people follow, okay.
I've seen people be in place of leadership that people did not want to follow.
Right?
Providing guidance.
Okay, leadership to me is someone that can be put in a position even though they feel they're not ready for it, but yet they take a hold of it and they can run with it and go with it and be somebody that others will want to follow.
Okay, that's a development, yes?
A leadership and an elder, which I just had, is leading by example.
Okay, that's a trait. Here's a definition of leadership. This is my definition of leadership. Okay? Leadership is the art. It's an art, not a science. It's the art of getting a disparate, D-I-S-P-A-R-A-T-E, meanings different. The art of getting a disparate group of people to work together to accomplish a common goal. A leader has to be an artist in this regard. Leadership is the art of getting a disparate group of people to work together to accomplish a common goal. Because everybody in a small group is going to have a different opinion on practically everything. Okay? But if I take two people and I task them to a thing, one of them is going to be a leader. Because in a group of any number, one will come out as being stronger than the other in leadership. And it may be but just because they're forceful, arrogant, braggadocious. Why are you looking at Brian?
He's a great leader.
Or it may be that the other person is just as good a leader but recognizes that in this instant, it's good for me to step back and be a follower. What's a follower? What's followership? Again, it's an art. It's an art of submitting oneself to the leadership of another. It's very easy.
It's very hard, it's almost harder to be a follower than it is to be a leader. Because you have to step back. I mean, if you're a born leader, it's hard
Yeah.
to step back and be a follower.
We're going to talk about whether a leader is born or made. Yeah. So this is where humility comes in. Humility is given to us as an example of leadership in the Bible. Who was humble? Jesus was humble, but who was humble before Jesus? Moses. Moses was said to be the most humble person there was. He was the leader of God's people. Humility. And let me tell you something, if you're a leader and you don't have humility, just stand by. Because you're going to how you handle that is part of your art of leadership too. Because a humble leader can't just say, okay, I quit, and leave the group. A humble leader has to be able to swallow hard, admit when they're wrong, pick up the reins, ride some more. Okay? So, we talked about leadership. What is a leader? A leader is, well, what is leadership? A leadership is the art of getting a disparate group of people to work together to achieve a common goal. You do that if you're a leader anywhere, but in the church, just because we're in the same family, you know how families can be vicious to one another, doesn't mean that we're all going to just follow you because you've been put in charge. You have to have the art. And when one of us is being, when I recognize that Joe has the leadership in this situation, my art then is to step back and allow him to lead and support him in his leadership. And Joe will come and ask me if he needs help. I know that about Joe because I'll ask him. And Clay will do the same thing. And Eddie will do the same thing. And Brian will do the same thing, does it every day, probably. Harlan will do the same thing. James, everybody will do the same thing. I've named all the men because this is a, Now we're going to talk about women's leadership in church too. We're going to talk about women's role in leadership in the church. We just can't do it today because we're nearly out of time already. Merle? Oh, it's the bearded lady. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Merle. I just had to quit. I didn't name Adam either. But I just had to move on. Okay, so what does the Bible say about leadership? So everybody turn to Exodus chapter 18, please. Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18. We're going to read verses 13 through 26. Exodus 18. There we go. First bell. 13 through 26. Read with me here. It came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now when Moses' father-in-law saw all he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this thing you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor, and make known the statutes of God and His laws." And Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing you're doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, and the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Listen to me. I shall give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they do. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. And you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. And let it be that every major dispute they bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace." So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, and made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. What does that say about leadership? How early is this in the history of the Bible?
Pretty early.
It's pretty early. Do we have subdivisions in groups? In our corporate world, do we have subdivisions? We have a CEO, then we have a vice president, and then we have directors, and then we have, of course in the military, you've got your commanding officer and your sergeant major, and then your troops, littler troops. Because the CO can't run everything on his own. He requires assistance. What about in the family? How do we run things in the family? We have a leader, one leader. We have a helper. This is the biblical standard, right? We have a leader, the man. We have a helper, the wife. And then we have the kids. Okay? What else can I say? This is called delegation. And we simply cannot lead any unit without delegation. Unit of church, unit of family, In the church, what do we have? Elders, deacons, minister. Actually, some people don't even consider the minister to be a leader.
Well, there are ministry leaders here. We have Waterford Ministries.
Right, well, I meant the preacher. Yeah. So sometimes they won't even put the preacher in the hierarchy because it's not a biblical thing, right? So you have the elders and the deacons, and then you have the assigned ministers, right, of minister of whatever, youth minister or whatever. And then they exercise leadership roles, and the people line up under them, right? So even in the congregation, we have what did I say it was? No? Delegation, yeah, delegation. This is again reflected in Deuteronomy chapter 1, 12 through 18, if you want to write that down. It's really an account of what happened in Exodus that we just read, but it's Deuteronomy chapter 1, 12 through 18, okay? So we're not going to read it again, but turn with me over to 1 Samuel, please. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. Now this is when Samuel is going to choose the king that the people want over Israel. Look in verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for God looks at the outward appearance. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Second bell. What have we discussed so far in the past 20 minutes? Leadership. Very good, Merle. We discussed a definition of leadership, which is what?
The art of...
Did you not write this stuff down?
I did. The art of getting a disparate group of people to attain a common goal.
To work together to obtain a common goal. What is followership? Good. It's an art. The art of submitting yourself to a leader to accomplish the leader's goals. How often do you fall into a leadership role? You never know what's going to happen. How often do you fall into a followership role? You're in one right now. Because I'm leading this class, and you are submitting yourselves to listen to me. Okay? And you've done a great job at this, by the way. You're all great followers. We've talked about a little bit of Scripture. We talked about how the churches are set up. We've talked about we need to get into how we develop leaders and what a leader brings, the elements of leadership. I meant to go through all of that today. But a guided discussion is impossible to predict. Okay? And so think about these things over the week. We'll come back and re-engage next Sunday. Any questions? Good? No? You like what we've talked about so far? Okay. All right. Well, let's have a prayer. I'm going to turn this mic off.